Right, welcome everyone. My clock says 1:01, so we can go ahead and get started kind of with our logistics and housekeeping. Thanks to all who are attending today. Appreciate you taking the time to join us. My name is Betsy Carley. And just for some housekeeping, just wanted to let everyone know that you probably saw we are recording this webinar, and the link will be emailed out to all the registrants. So certainly be looking for that if you'd like to watch the recording. And then, as is typical with a webinar, we are running this in the webinar format. It just is easier to see questions if they're in the Q&A. We do have Jamie from my office who is joining us today, who will also be monitoring the chat. But it's usually a little easier if the questions are in that Q&A, if you can do it that way. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm gonna kick us off to talk about a risk assessment tool for bovine respiratory disease in dairy calves. And for those of you who I don't know, my name is Betsy Carley. I'm a UC Cooperative Extension Dairy Advisor. I'm based in Northern California in the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. So I work with dairy producers in Northern California to do research and educational programs, many of who were involved in the research that we're going to be sharing today. So just to kind of give you an idea of the scope and landscape of this research, Dr. Sharif Ali is a principal investigator for all of the information that we're going to be sharing today. And he was supported by his grad students who are listed there at the top, who are now well out of grad school and out doing great things in the industry. Collaborations and co-principal investigators throughout the UC Davis Vet School, UC Cooperative Extension, California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab, California Department of Food and Agriculture, really wide collaboration, the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. And then also there was quite a large multi-institutional research team that took part in much of this. And then, of course, industry. We absolutely could not do any of this work without the collaboration of the dairy producers, the veterinarians, herd managers, everyone who lets us ask crazy questions and try crazy things and get all of this information that hopefully helps move the industry forward. So just to really dive in as far as respiratory disease goes, in pre-weaned calves, which is what we're going to be focusing on today, it is responsible for 22% of mortality in that population of calves. As part of this research, we did calculate the economic cost of respiratory disease in a young calf and found that to be just over $42, looking at medication and labor, but not necessarily taking into account the longer term costs of animal loss and reduced productivity that we know are impacts that respiratory disease has in the long run. So obviously something that we care a lot about and would like to find some solutions to. It does come with lots of diagnostic challenges. It's a multifactorial disease, can be caused by virus, bacteria, environmental factors, and can present in really a variety of ways. A wide range of severity. The different stages of the illness can look very different, and individual calves are going to present really differently as well. Diagnostic tests are a bit challenging. Gold standard is going to be, a laboratory a test that is going to take some time to get back to the producer. So something that we wanted to address in some of this research. And then variability between observers, especially on our larger dairies, as we have here in California. Lots of people are taking care of calves on a day-to-day basis, and the same clinical signs might look different to different individuals, and we wanted to kind of try to find a way to make that a little bit more consistent. So one of the first things we came up with was this, which hopefully many people have seen. This is our BRD scoring system for pre-weaned dairy calves. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as we go through, but just kind of wanted to share a visual of what we're talking about. So really it's meant to be a simplified system where an observer, a calf caretaker can look at an animal and look for these 6 clinical signs and pretty quickly be able to determine if a calf is dealing with respiratory disease and if it's time to go to the protocols that you've established with your veterinarian to treat the disease. So eye discharge, nasal discharge, ear droop, head tilt, cough, breathing, and temperature. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slides, but just want to let you know that this visual is available and folks can feel free to contact me if this is something that you would find helpful in your work. I do also have it available in Spanish as well for easier use by many of our employees on our California farms. And then just to get into some of the details on the scoring system, really, you're looking for a greater than or equal score of 4 or 5 to indicate if a calf is positive for respiratory disease. So that can look different depending on the clinical signs that are present. If the calf is showing a ear droop or a head tilt, that score is 5, so that immediately indicates that that calf is positive for respiratory disease. The nice thing about this system is as we look at things like eye discharge and nasal discharge, it doesn't matter if it's pussy or green or crusty or any of those stratifications of the clinical sign. If it's present, they get a positive score. So, for example, if we have nasal discharge, that is a 4-point score. So any other sign would also indicate that the calf has respiratory disease. Or any 3 clinical signs are going to add up to at least 6. So that's another indication, given a quick look, that the calf is positive. The beauty, one of the things that's beautiful about this system is I think we can all agree that jumping into calf hutches to get rectal temperatures is not on the top of anyone's favorite list of chores. So the rectal temperature actually is only needed if the score is 4. So say the calf has a cough and is breathing heavily, but doesn't have any nasal discharge or eye discharge, then that's a case where we probably want to get in and take a temperature to really decide if that's a calf that we want to treat or not. But oftentimes, the scoring system will help you understand where a calf is at in the disease status without actually needing that rectal temperature. So with that being kind of a foundation for the work, one of the first research activities that we did with the dairy producers was sending out a survey. And we looked at 28 different management areas and found that 22 of those that are listed here on the slide were responsible for the vast majority, almost 70% of the variability in the responses that we received. And so those are the areas that we focused our research on. Our next step was to do a pretty in-depth look on 104 dairies. So we called this the BRD 100 study. It's a little catchier than BRD 104. We did add 4 extra in there. And the research team went around to dairies all throughout California to conduct in-person interviews and do an on-farm management assessment to really get an in-depth look at the management practices on those dairies. With that, we coupled BRD prevalence, which Dr. Ali will talk more about that later in this webinar, and then correlated that with management practices and to come up with some associations that would help us start to understand how management is affecting respiratory disease in California. So I do want folks to note that, kind of that central south central part of California is where a really large number of our dairies are, and so we certainly tried to, focus on that area, but really capture the geographic diversity of California. The solid lines on the maps indicate our separation of our different regions. So Northern California, Northern San Joaquin Valley, and the greater Southern California area. And we did see some regional differences that we're not going to get into today, but people can certainly reference either of these papers for more information about the BRD 100 study. Some of the things that we noticed, this will show just, some of the regional differences, but just to kind of give an example of some of the information we got from that particular study, we did see that in this left-hand graph, we did see differences in BRD prevalence as it related to calf age. And then also if the animals were group housed or individually housed. So probably not surprising to everyone, but it was helpful to capture the information on these 100 dairies and see where those differences really showed up. Also, hutch materials or pen materials was something that we found to be pretty interesting that I'll talk a little bit more about here in a few slides. But we did notice that you'll notice on the metal hutch there, especially in the Northern California region, that NCA, that something was going on there where we were seeing more prevalence of respiratory disease in calves housed in those types of pens. And again, you can see their group pens, which were only found in Northern California, had a pretty high prevalence respiratory disease as well. So just an example of some of the things that fed into our risk assessment that we took a little closer look at. So our next step was what we called the BRD 10K study. As I mentioned, those regions, we geographically distributed 6 dairies throughout those 3 regions to follow in a longitudinal study design where we enrolled calves for just over a year, actually ended up enrolling over 11,000 calves, and really followed them throughout the pre-weaning period to better correlate the risk factors with respiratory disease as they're geographically distributed, not only throughout the state, but also across breeds. And we did have a fairly wide range of weaning ages from 50 to 100 days. So there's quite a bit of diversity in the way calves are raised in California. So after all that, we came up with the BRD risk assessment tool, which is what we'll spend most of the time here discussing. And it really fell into these 6 categories that were related kind of to that original survey that we did. So herd demographics, maternity pen management, colostrum management, feeding programs, vaccination, and housing. So this is jumping ahead a little bit, but just kind of wanted to give folks an overall look at how these risk assessment scores sort of measured up across the different categories. And we'll get into a little bit more detail, but ultimately we analyzed the risk factors and assigned a risk score to each one in each of these categories. So you can see the scores by category are pretty different. There are some categories that are definitely have more opportunities for management interventions than other areas. So let's dive in a little bit on the sections and just to give folks an idea of what this risk assessment looks like. This is something we have on paper that we can certainly share with folks, but as you'll see, as we go a little further through the webinar, Dr. Ali will be sharing our risk assessment app, which is probably the most efficient way to conduct this risk assessment on either your farm or client farm. So when we look at general risk of the herd, these are things that we don't have a lot of control over. Season is something that is fairly significant, and we do see respiratory disease have different challenges as we go through the year, but obviously that's not something we have a lot of control over too. We did see that, crossbred animals are lower risk, which is not surprising, but again, not something that people are necessarily changing management practices on. And then average number of herd size did have some correlation to respiratory disease risk. And just something that we observed to kind of be a baseline risk score for a dairy. So then we get into management practices that could potentially be modified on a dairy. And just to highlight some in this particular section, we noticed in maternity pen management that changing bedding in the calving pens was pretty strongly associated with the risk of respiratory disease in those calves, and also the type of bedding used in those maternity pens was significant as well, and had a fairly high maximum risk score. Colostrum management, I don't think I need to tell this audience how important colostrum is. This is just one more data point to indicate how very important it is, and kind of get to some of the specifics on management practices that folks should really be considering for the health of these pre-weaned calves. So of course, volume of and quality of colostrum is exceptionally important, and monitoring that is always advised. Heat treatment of colostrum, it's getting certainly to be a more widely adopted practice, but we did see quite a significant association with a maximum score of 20 if the colostrum is not heat treated. So that's something that dairies that haven't adopted that practice might want to consider. Time of storage of colostrum was also pretty highly significant as well. Other factors in colostrum management, I mentioned quality, so certainly that has a pretty high score. And then we did notice that storing colostrum in bags was throughout these studies associated with lower risk of respiratory disease. In calf milk feeding, this was an area where you can see at the bottom the total risk score of 244. This was one of our highest categories. And so certainly an area that we really encourage people to take a close look at. Most specifically, feeding order of calves, both by age and health. So, feeding healthy calves first is associated with less respiratory disease. Feeding the youngest calves first, also associated with respiratory disease. And then related to the colostrum that we just talked about, also milk, pasteurizing the milk that's fed to calves was really a high scoring category when it came to calf milk feeding. Quality, again, is exceptionally important, but one that I really want to highlight is how much milk is fed to calves. I think we're really evolving to be feeding our calves more on a higher plane of nutrition, but especially for Holsteins, if those calves were getting less than 4 quarts a day, less than a gallon, except for that very short amount of time before weaning, really we're seeing some associations with more respiratory disease in those calves. So that's definitely a risk factor that we'd like people to take a look at. Vaccination was also significant, specifically vaccinating cows. So you can see that has a maximum score of 27. Certainly some protection offered to those cows and transferred to colostrum was very important for managing risk of respiratory disease. And then housing, we had lots of significant categories here. Dust abatement was a big one, especially if it was ineffective dust control. So for example, a water truck rolling on down is creating a whole bunch of dust before it sprays the water to kind of settle all of that dust. So if effective dust control on our study dairies, it was associated with less respiratory disease, and so that's something that can certainly be managed on farms. Another one we found interesting was extra shade being offered. So if there was no additional shade, that was associated with a higher risk of respiratory disease, whereas something like a shade cloth or a roof but no sidewalls was associated with a lot lower respiratory disease. What else? So also calf-to-calf contact, so that gets to the spread of disease and potentially group housing there. This is where our hutch material came into as well, where we saw that those metal components on the hutches were somehow associated with respiratory disease, but also mitigated by extra shade. So something to consider going forward. If calf pens had a flush system under them, I found that if fresh water was used, it was fairly low risk, or if there was no flush. But using recycled lagoon water under calves certainly had some associations with more respiratory disease. So that's kind of a quick run through of the risk assessment tool. And again, I'm showing those categories that we score with the risk assessment. And so this is something that can be used on the dairy to analyze potentially the risk of respiratory disease. So that would be step one, would be to use this questionnaire and the risk scores to to kind of see where areas of higher risk are on a particular herd. I mentioned that Dr. Ali is going to talk about estimating the prevalence in a herd, but using the scoring system in the app, we do have a way to do that very easily. So that would be getting an idea of how many calves at any one time are being affected by respiratory disease. So the next steps are to implement management changes and then reassess and see if the control measures have have made an impact on the prevalence of respiratory disease. So that looks like taking each of these categories and identifying where possible changes are or could be made. So if you have a high scoring risk category, that might be something you'd like something on the dairy to change to address that. And then importantly, assigning those changes to personnel specifically are really important to ensure that they're implemented. And so we'd encourage, picking a few categories that kind of are maybe low-hanging fruit where you could make a change, perhaps, to the maternity bin, and instead of changing bedding in the maternity pen twice a month, let's try going to 4 times a month and see if that potentially makes a difference. And then really assigning that to someone specifically so that they are responsible and have kind of ownership of that task. And then we would encourage a follow-up, like with the next cohort of calves, to reassess the risk and do a prevalence measurement again to see if any of the control measures that have been implemented have made a difference. Obviously, this is a great opportunity to verify the changes were implemented, to identify any bottlenecks or challenges with implementing those changes, and seeing if prevalence has actually been decreased. So just kind of as a high-level overview, I just want to review some of the kind of higher risk categories where we saw some pretty significant associations with respiratory disease. So this is a list of practices that in these studies we found to be associated with less risk of respiratory disease. So things we already talked about, but just to as a reminder, vaccinating dams against respiratory disease, frequently changing the maternity pen bedding, heat treating colostrum, storing colostrum in bags as opposed to bottles, feeding more than 4 quarts of milk per day, using bulk tank milk, so whether that be saleable or even waste milk, was associated with less respiratory disease as controlled to milk replacer, just due to that nutrient density to feed to those calves. But importantly, pasteurizing that bulk tank or waste milk was significant as well. Individual housing was associated with less respiratory disease, as was additional shade or shelter over the calves. Now, as far as increased risk of respiratory disease, that feeding the calves less than 3 quarts of milk a day was significant. Flushing with lagoon water under the hutches, something to do with these metal components on the animal housing. I don't think we've actually figured out what what that all means, but it was something that the statistics told us was important. However, with the extra shade, that was greatly reduced. Group housing, I think we still have a lot to figure out when it comes to group housing. Obviously, there are benefits to group housing that we'd like to capture, but respiratory disease really does remain a challenge in those systems. And then the ineffective use of a water truck or increased dust in the calf housing area is definitely low-hanging fruit that can be managed to decrease respiratory disease. So with that, I could take any quick questions, or we can go right into Dr. Ali's presentation. I kind of can't see anything, so I'm trying to get back my view here to see if there's any. I don't think we have any questions in the Q&A. So I think I will go ahead and stop sharing and let Dr. Ali take over and share about the app.
Excellent. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Sharif Ali. I'm a veterinary epidemiologist at the VetMed Teaching and Research Center in Tulare, California. And glad to share the webinar today with my good colleague, Betsy Carley. And I will try to share my screen. Okay. So,
just need to switch your view.
Oh, okay. Which screen is it on now? Let's start again. Oops, okay, sorry. Let me share one more time. This one.
Perfect.
Thank you. So it just feels odd not showing really the credit for the people who've helped with this and the good colleagues and students. So um, I definitely want to acknowledge them and share that it's been a great pleasure to work with every one of those colleagues and students who are now colleagues. And the industry definitely, and the funding that we got for this, we've been very fortunate to lead this, all of us together. So with that said, I'll just try to merge in with what Betsy had left, where Betsy had left to, is that we really want to get to this specific table where we want to score a herd based on these 6 areas and identify their risk score for every single one of those areas and the total overall grand total score, risk score, if you will. And so the higher the numbers, the greater the risk. And that's the density of the red shade there in coloring. But also perhaps notice the, if you will, the range of scores. You can see that calf housing really has maxes up into the 200s, and versus, for example, something like vaccinations. And while that may show you importance by area of management, it's kind of important to realize that also in California, for example, we do quite a bit of vaccinations. So it may have not been the problem, but that doesn't mean that vaccination is not the biggest, it's not one of the problems. It may not be the biggest, but it doesn't mean that it's not one of the problems. If say, management changes to the point where vaccinations are less, then you come into a situation where the statewide herd then may probably have more problems that could have solved by vaccination. And in that case, you can see this can change also over time. So it's very important just to realize that what I'm calling is the attributable fraction, or the proportion attributable to every one of those management areas, and that they all really are important even the ones that you're doing a good job at, they're still going to be important. So keep doing a good job at it. To get to this score, the herd, we have to realize that there's quite a bit of different management areas that need to be assessed, and we have limited time. Some of those dairies are quite big, with large cohorts of calves being raised. So part of it is really we realize very quickly we can't really just take uh, uh, the questionnaire in a paper format and go around asking questions and try to tally the totals, and by management area also, you can imagine that will just take time. So we realized very quickly that we need an app, and over the years we're fortunate to have that happen very quickly, and there were different versions of it, and at some point it was available in app and Google Play stores, but we lost the Google Play Store for about a few years, and we for a while you wondered, should we keep supporting the app? And you get emails every now and then from people in North America, actually Canada too, and several in the US that would say, we're doing follow up with this, we're doing a research study with this app. So we put some more funding, and we managed to secure funding to actually rebuild the Android and the iOS app, the Apple app that is, and add translations to it completely this time, and have the whole risk assessment incorporated in multiple languages, including English and Spanish. And so the next thing was, do we keep the UC Davis BRD scoring app? And we realized that if we update it, it will cancel some of the older apps versions that were in the phones of the current users. So we decided to keep that and support it for now, probably for another year or so, maybe 12 months max, and then we'll switch. We'll leave only the second app, which is now the UC Davis BRD Risk. So the UC Davis BRD Risk is currently online. I checked as of this today, the iOS and the Android, and it's available for free also, and now has the Spanish translation for the risk assessment questionnaire, with the help of a lot of colleagues and translators. So let me walk you through it and see how far we can get. But once you open the app, there's the menu, and now you can see it has the risk assessment. In the settings, and I don't show you here as a screenshot, but the settings will allow you to switch between languages immediately. So the app itself will switch automatically without you having to go switch the language of your phone that you're using. And so beside the scoring feature, which you guys may be familiar with, but you've also seen the scoring system chart that Betsy had shown on her slides, very similar to it, but it will tally the scores, and the bubble that's top right there will turn red or green based on if it's a BRD score, positive or negative. But I'll walk you through the prevalence and the risk assessment and a little bit of the history today. So if you click on the risk assessment, this opens up the intro screenshot that you can start a risk assessment with it. And once you're completed with one, it's auto-saved into the archive, which you can access your risk assessments, prior risk assessments through it also. The next slide shot will allow you to enter the dairy name and the herd vet and who's doing the assessing, and the prevalence estimate, which we'll talk about once I finish this. If you click start, you'll get an option to start with the very first area of management, which is the basic herd risk profile. And once selecting that one, or if you're returning to the risk assessment, you don't have to worry about losing where you're at. You could continue to come to wherever you stopped, unlike in the prior version. But if you click on basic herd risk assessment, or whichever section comes after that, you will see the questions as boxes and the total score points in them for each question. And these are the risk points, actually. Next, so I'll walk you through a few sections. I won't walk you through all of them, so I don't belabor you. But if, for example, the basic herd risk profile, it asks about the average herd size, and you'll see that these points are based on regression models, two types of regression models from the two study designs that Betsy spoke about. But there's a reference, and there is the higher the score or the point, the higher the risk, if you will. Once you've selected, it tells you how many points so far the herd has scored out of the total for that management practice. So if you click next after that, you'll take you to the basic herd risk profile, where it asks if you're organic or not. The next would be basic herd risk profile, asking about the season. And so in this case, again, the season data is based on the two studies. And then we ask you about the herd composition in breed. And this one, we want to enter it as a proportion. So 50% would be 0.5, if you will. But once you've completed the section, it will show you the different columns from that chart with the red heat map, if you will. But this time it shows you which category your herd falls in terms of risk. And if you're wondering why the points didn't change between the screenshots, because I had already filled in the question, this section, and had already scored 47 points. So this herd scored between 46 and 56, and so it's a low baseline or basic herd risk profile. If we go to the next section, so you have the maternity pen management. We asked, do cows and heifers calve together? And so that's out of a model, again, either an odds ratio or a hazard ratio pointed at about 8 points out of a total of 1,000 or so points that were worth the higher risk if they calve together. And so because you've selected here a management practice that scored with some risk points, the next screen that you will be going into will ask you for the intervention that you would like to apply. And I mean, there's of course recommendations, and we realized very soon that every management is different. So there's one, even though it's the same separation of cows from heifers, this may be a totally different way to pose it for herd 1 versus herd 2. So for example, it could be a middle gate may be closed to separate cows from heifers. It could be creating a separate maternity pen if that's feasible on another dairy. So we decided early on to let you enter that the way you believe it's best suited and most suitable and doable also in the herd that you're dealing with. And so once you've done that, it's saved somewhere in the app, and then you go to the next question, and it asks, how often do you change the maternity pen bedding? And we give you exactly the levels of the regression model that came out from running the analysis. And so it's really more than 5 times per month that triggered 0 points. So it has to be 6 times per month at least to be the lowest risk. But 5 or less, and 95% of the cows calve individually, it scored higher points than if they were in group pens. And we wondered about that a little bit, but I don't have the trial that showed that. But when you walk in a group calving pen, the cows are smart. They won't lay in an area that's soiled already from a prior calving, whether it be a few minutes ago or 2 days ago. The cows will choose a nice place, nice dry place to nest in it, if you will, if they can. But in an individual maternity pen, if it's not really cleaned, what will happen is the whole area will get soiled quickly. If it's not clean between cows that calve, the whole area will soil quickly. And that's my impression from seeing the herds and some of the herds that I've been on. And of course, if less than 5 times, and they have a mix of individual and group pens, the data showed us that was much less risk than either 2 or 3 options. The next slide again, or the next screenshot, will show you what change you want to do. And so, for example, it could be something like every weekday or so, a specific weekday that the maternity pen bedding will be pushed off before the far offs are moved in, let's say, into the maternity pen. So some details may be entered, and I was working a couple years back with somebody. We would actually say, right, who's the worker or the staff who's going to help with that. So there's kind of it helps resolve a lot of the bottlenecks if you come back later on in the follow-up and you realize that, oh, I'm not sure why I didn't get a decrease in prevalence. So that would help you go back and troubleshoot. So who was responsible for this or that? So I'll take you to the next part of the maternity pen management. And that's a repetition of that one, but we'll go to the middle set of screenshots. What type of bedding do you use in the calving pens? And so let's say you select plant materials, and again, that would be extra points, risk score points. And so you'll get an option to also have a screenshot that will allow you to enter the change if possible. And not every single risk factor will be managed in that particular session. You could choose to pick the low-hanging fruit, the ones that the producer is willing to address and tackle at that point in time, given all what's going on. And so other questions include, do you calves or heifers calve in a pasture? And there's a dynamic there as to how many of them are calve in a pasture, if yes or no, and if the calves are moved immediately from the dam or not. That's another factor to that. So all of these are interaction terms in the model, if you will. But again, this specific herd scored low on the maternity pen risk management. We tell you it's out of 50 right here. Once you've done with the sections, you can then move to the next section by selecting through the menu that between every section. And so I won't go through all of them, but housing was a cool one, so I'm going to skip to that one right away. And so you immediately see there are 9 questions, and and I'll skip to the interesting ones. They're all interesting, but this is like very interesting because is there a flush system for manure removal under the hutch? And yeah, I think we all know we're still in a drought state right now. But at some point, there were dairies actually that flushed with fresh water, especially those concerned with yonis. That's a big risk factor there. And so recycled lagoon water actually considerably was contributing about 59 points in the total risk system. So perhaps scraping between rather than flushing between calves and maybe once or even more, and how that herd scored or fared was got very low scores because it was still less than 119, the upper limit of the very low. So if I take you next, once you're done with that, you'll see that there are different scores for colostrum, milk feeding, vaccinations, housing, and these are tallied here in a table for you to see how the herd scored out of the max score, and then overall how the herd scored across all these 6 management areas. And so in this case, this herd scored 313 out of a total of 1,000 points. And that would be a low score. At this point, you have a couple options to preview the report or send it to the producer or to yourself. And so the report allows you to, it actually self-populates the information you've entered. So anything in light blue font has been already entered into the report PDF, and then you can email that. But it also shows you the table that came up from the risk assessment once it was complete. And then wherever there were changes that you had suggested, it will list under the specific or respective um, 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 management area what the score was and the question and what you had entered in your intervention. And if there was a score positive and you didn't enter anything, it will leave it empty. So you can then enter that, hand type that if you want, handwrite it or type it on the PDF. But we noticed that it was kind of difficult to sit and then kind of talk about all the changes again. We realized the report is very important and allows you to have that document on that day and time that says these are the things that we can change, and then the producer can select from them what they wish or they can he or she can do at that time on their dairy. And so this is an example here, with the maternity pen management, for example, the changing of the bedding pens, in this case, the colostrum. So this had to do with checking the colostrum with a refractometer and making sure that if it's pooled, that it's actually good quality. For example, there's one more here I think we had, yes. So consider other calf manure management option other than flushing, and definitely not flushing when the calf is feeding, maybe instead of daily, every other day. These are all ways that you can still handle that. So the scoring system is then comes into play because you want to score a subset of the calves. You won't be able to score all the calves if you have one of those big dairies, but it helps you to estimate a prevalence for, as I said, a sample of the calves on the dairy. And the nice thing about it, as Betsy said, it's a simplified scoring system. So eventually it summarizes very quickly to basically three rules. You know, if you have an abnormal ear, if you have nasal discharge and any other sign, or any three signs, you got a BRD score positive calf. And the nice thing is you don't need to jump into the hutch and take a temperature with every calf. You only do that if the combined total of the visible scores is 4 or exactly 4. Then at this point, you're not quite sure whether fever exists or not, because if it exists, then it's a BRD score positive, and you want to jump in and get the temperature of the hutch, of the calf in the hutch, if you will. And so once you've had that, uh, you can then, once you have the risk assessment and you're familiar with the scoring system, you can do a prevalence estimate. And the app again walks you through trying to get a true random sample of the prevalence of BRD score positive calves in the herd. So you enter the bound, which is the amount of error that you're willing to live with. And I highly recommend you stick with default values that we think are within the manageable sample size, so you don't end up estimating having to score 1,000 of all 1,200 calves. Well, we really set it at about, optimize it around 70 to 100 calves. Even in bigger herds with 2,000 calves, it will kind of max at about 120 or so. But if you enter the assumed prevalence, which 0.25 is fair, that's the average of the state, you actually get number of weaned calves that you need to score. And what you need to do is stand at the start of the row of one of the first rows, either side of the hutch matrix, as I like to call it, and then walk the hutches one by one. And the app will tell you how many of so many calves you have to score. You need to score the calf number 31. So you count 31 hutches from the first, and that would be the calf that you would score. And it would tell you once you're done. It tells you already the next the next hutch to score, calf to score is in hutch number 4, four hutches away. So you count 4 hutches. So you leave your hutch and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, and score that calf also. And, and if sometimes if the calf is dead, the hutch is of course empty, then you just click calf is not present, and it will get you a new number, if you will. But once you're done with scoring, again, you need a report. And so at this point, this report is from the older version, but you still get it, and you can still get a percent that you can add to your original risk assessment. And that allows you to add, for example, in this case, this was 7.5% prevalence of BRD. So both together go in hand. And yeah, that's the history function. It allows you to see all the calves that you scored, and if you had any comments in there. But I wanna just say that the next part is the most important. You've spent a lot of time. You went to the dairy, you scored calves, you sat with the producer, and maybe the vet was there too or not, and you end up actually talking to them about the changes. But it really all matters 2-3 months later when you come back and see if changes happen or not. If you verify the changes and you look at the prevalence again estimate one more time, so you go through the risk assessment one more time and the prevalence estimation, it'll tell you what changes happened or what didn't, and you'll know from their answers what changes were supposed to happen and didn't happen. And if you measure the prevalence one more time, hopefully you see the prevalence change and actually towards the right direction, which is lower. If not, then we need to then troubleshoot and see what are the bottlenecks, what was supposed to be done, and was it done as agreed to, or were there difficulties, and how can these difficulties be mitigated? But in a sense, this can quickly assess for you the situation on the dairy with calf management, and identify, in a very objective way, without stress, without being under pressure to change many things all of a sudden. At least you know now what should be changed, and the producer can get some buy-in based on your recommendation. So I want to stop here for a second I had a few slides, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to uh, have questions and see if you guys are, if we can answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah, we have about 9 minutes for questions. I have a couple here in a queue that were sent to me, and if people want to enter other questions, we can certainly would like to answer those as well. But I can start with some of the ones that I have here. You mentioned on that there was an assumed prevalence, and I think it was 25% in the uh, one that you showed. What is the typical prevalence of respiratory disease, and then when would a producer start to get concerned that they had a high prevalence? So, like you showed, if I'm interpreting this question correctly, like you showed on that report that it was a 7.5% prevalence. Would someone want to implement changes, or is that
Well,
low enough?
if there's interest in making it lower, why not? So if there's interest and if there's the effort to make it lower than that, that would be great. I think seven is yeah, between 7 and 10. Okay, between 7 and 10, we've seen that quite a bit. Um, the average, if you will, is about 23% in the state when we did these studies. Um, and it doesn't really contrast far away from others. So I put the slide here where Windar et al. Noted 22, NOMS said 18 is nationwide. Earlier study in California actually showed higher. But that's about the herd of the state herd, if you will, or the national herd. It varies a little bit by region. So you'll see differences by region. And um, I want to say that if you're in the over 10%, you definitely do you could do something about trying to lower it. I like to see things that BRD probably 5 to 8. If I'm closer to 10, I start wondering what are we losing.
Okay, great. And then we have another question. In the metal hutches, have the ambient temperatures been measured to determine if the risk is related to heat stress?
Yes,
Good
yes,
question.
that's a great question. So Dr. Alyssa Louie had done that study in the microenvironment inside the hutch. And yeah, we've measured temperatures. It's interestingly temperature was um, more important in the summer than the humidity. I think another study done later on, and that's actually under review now, showed that in other times of the year, humidity was still important. Um, and I think what I want to just say is that there is a microenvironment within that hutch. Um, and the metal hutches, I don't know if you're familiar with the names. I kind of can't remember the name now, but the metal hutch has a name, and it comes with a reputation actually that it kills calves. And later on, I knew that. I didn't know that when we were doing the study. But the heat goes right through it, and there's just no break for the calves in the summer with the metal hutch walls or roof, if you will, too.
Okay, and then we have a question about bedding. So bedding in the hutches with manure compost, is that better than plant material, or is that just for maternity cows?
But you can answer these questions too, Betsy. I don't know
I
too.
know, but I like giving them to you. I'll go ahead and answer this one. But yes, so the bedding, specifically the risk factor that we showed, that was bedding in the maternity pen. Um, I think the bedding in the calf pens actually fell out of the risk assessment for the calves. And certainly a lot of these herds that we looked at were not bedded, were in California style slatted floor wooden hutches. So that's something that I think would be really interesting to get some more information on. Maybe in a different study would be looking at calf bedding, probably even as it relates to that microclimate that we discussed related to the metal hutches as well. So, and I guess I would guess also additionally say that plant material is not necessarily bad. It was just associated in these studies with potentially being a risk factor. But it was one of those where it wasn't a super high score. So, you know, I would think there's other lower hanging fruit probably if your dairy has a challenge with respiratory disease. That it would be interesting to go through the risk assessment and see if there are higher risk categories that could be managed first and foremost, because you can't do it all. You kind of have to pick what's the easiest to implement, and it is really going to be practical for a herd, and that doesn't mean you can do everything.
Absolutely, I agree. And it's all also the devil is in the details. Are they using plant material and changing it regularly? And you can walk through the maternity pen and you don't see soiled areas that have been there for a week, and cows are not finding a nice dry spot to nest and give birth. Um, so if they're not taking care of the bedding, that risk score becomes even more correct. And if they're taking care of it, then they're they're probably fine. It's an average of the situation that we observed at that point in time with the prevalence observed compared to others like sand, for example. I think was the very best. That was just 0 score.
Okay, I don't think we have any additional questions, and just in the um, to keep us, right on time. Looks like we're coming to the top of the hour, so I just kind of want to wrap us up and thank everyone for attending our webinar. As we mentioned, this recording will be emailed out to all of the folks who registered for this webinar, and certainly feel free to, when you receive that link, share it with anyone else who may be interested as well. And with that, I'll wish everyone a good day, and stay cool out there in this toasty weather in California. And everyone take care. Thank you.